Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week's discussion is on the Highlander the card game, released in the mid-90s. This was released when two things were going on. First, Highlander the series was at the peak of its popularity, and it even spawned two spin-offs, the Raven and Highlander the animated series. Yes, let's not talk about the animated series. But the other thing going on at the time was that... So to begin with, I'm going to state that I'm going to be mostly talking about the first edition of the card game. I'm aware of the second and third editions, and in fact I've read the rules for those, though I have not actually played them. What I played was the first edition. I will touch on some of the changes made in the later editions, but I'm primarily going to focus on talking about the first edition. So, without further ado, let us begin where all card games start, building your deck. When you built your deck for Highlander the card game, the most important decision you had to make was which immortal you were going to use. Each immortal had abilities that affected how their deck was built. And these didn't just affect how their deck was built, they affected how you played. One great example is Slan Quincy. He had the ability that he could make or block power blows without having to make an exertion. I'll go into that later. This determined a lot about how you played in a deck with him. He was a deck that was an extremely aggressive deck, because you were not relying on trying to guess where things were or such. You were relying on simply battering down your opponent, forcing them to either be burning through their deck as they're making exertions to block your repeated, constant power blows, or just having them guess wrong where the blow is hitting and taking the damage, or not having the cards to block the attack, or just blocking it and taking the normal damage. And then you had Nefertiri. She had only a 13 ability, but she could draw up to her ability at any point during the turn. So she would go through cards in her deck fast. And so you would tend to build her decks a little bit bigger, just because you would have such a higher turnover of cards. Okay? So, once you've selected your immortal, and you've determined what sort of deck you're going to build, and you've pulled your immortal's special cards, you then would go on to building the rest of the deck with the basic attacks, basic defenses, and everything like that. The events, scenarios, plots, all that fun stuff. And then you'd play. Once you found your opponent, that is. When you're playing, this is where the game really stands out. This is where the game's differences are really noticeable. In many other card games, this is how the play goes. I do stuff on my turn. You have stuff that you can do to counteract stuff on my turn. And then I end my turn, and then you do stuff. And I have to counteract your stuff. Highlander didn't do that. Highlander actually did not involve playing that many cards a turn. You would play your first card. defense phase, you'd play a special card and a defense. Then would come attack phase, where you would play a special card and an attack. Both of those done in any order. Then you would draw up to your ability. Your opponent would then take their turn, and they would play the defense in response to your attack. And they would play their attack. If they took damage from your attack, they would reduce their ability accordingly. Understand that you started off with a 15-card hand. You had a lot you could do with your hand, but you didn't play that many cards. You literally played at most 4 cards a turn out of a 15-card hand. Your hand size equaled your ability. Your life, basically. Your life total. Your deck was called your endurance. Many other card games at the time did one of two things. Either when your deck ended, you were out of the game. You lost. Or they either put in a basic redraw mechanic of you reshuffle the deck, or it was you just had what was in your hand. What happened here with Highlander was when you reach the end of your deck, you lose 5 from your ability, and then you reshuffle your deck. But that's where things were fun. That's where you could build decks that the purpose of them was to make your opponent burn through their endurance. Make them have to take the damage from reshuffling their deck. You didn't do this by milling, directly removing the cards off their deck. You did this by making them have to make exertions. Now, I've mentioned exertion several times. What an exertion was you had to draw 5 cards. And you'd end up discarding them. But there were things you could do for an exertion. If you didn't have a defense card, you could make an exertion for that. Try to get a defense card and do that. You could make an exertion to get an attack card. Say your opponent put up a block. Sorry, not a block, a guard. This was a defense that stayed in play until you attacked. So if you put up a guard and then stayed in that, and all your opponent had were cards that went into that guard, your opponent was left with 2 choices. He could make an exertion to make a power blow, to force you to make an exertion to block his attack, or he could make an exertion to go into the other side of your block. Those were pretty much his options. In fact, a good player would set things up so their opponent had to fight like that. Had to make an exertion to do something. And then, of course, you have power blows. You'd make an exertion to make a power blow, and a normal attack, if it hit, does 2 damage. So, an unblocked attack does 2 damage. A power blow would do 4 damage if it wasn't blocked, 2 if it was blocked normally, or 0 if the opponent blocked with an exertion. Of course, if you had no actions to do during your turn, you would also take you also had to take an exertion. Not could, you had to play a card or take an exertion. You had to do something on your turn every turn. There was no just, I pass my turn. You had to do something or take an exertion. Now, when we start talking about what actually went down, how things worked, this is where things get really interesting. This is where I loved the combat mechanics for this game. Okay? How combat worked is as follows. Each attack targeted 1 square in a 9-square grid. So if an attack was named upper left, it would hit the upper left square in that grid. Thrust hit the square in the dead middle. Lower right hit the bottom right square. And then there were 3 different types of defenses. Blocks, which covered a 4 squares out of a corner. Guards, which would stay in play until you attacked. So if you didn't attack, you could keep a guard up. And those covered the side and middle columns. And then you had dodges. Dodges were either the same as guards, or they were the upper 6 or lower 6. And each of these had certain things going for them. Like the dodge. Dodge, you could dodge a power blow. You didn't have to block it. You could dodge some attacks, especially ranged attacks. There weren't that many of them. Slan Kinsey had the only one in the first edition. But you could dodge that. And of course, blocks were the standard. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a normal attack does 2 damage. Power blows did 4 damage or 2 damage. And, of course, if you made the exertion and blocked it, it did 0. With a standard attack, if you successfully blocked it, it did 0 damage. And what would happen is you would try to make your attacks. Try to set things up so your opponent couldn't block. And then there's what the power blow was really about. Or should I say the downside of the power blow. A power blow, yes, it could do more damage. Yes, your opponent had to make an exertion to completely stop it. Otherwise, they took damage of a normal attack. But you were at a disadvantage. Your opponent's next attack would be hidden. So, you would then be stuck having to figure out where your opponent's next attack was going to come when you laid your defense down. And hoping you guessed right. You could, if your block did not stop your opponent's attack and it was hidden, you could make an exertion to try and draw the card you need to block that. Understand, when you made an exertion, you could not play a card from your hand. You had to play the card from that exertion if you were making an exertion to find something. And combat was like that. You would make an attack, your opponent would block, then your opponent would make their attack, you'd block. And it was all about just trying to whittle each other down. Or make as many power blows as you could, and hope you could block the opposing attacks. But that was how it played out. All of that was how things were done in first edition. Second and later editions made changes that directly affected certain aspects of the game. The biggest was a change to deck building. What they did is they gave each immortal a set of stats. These stats determined how many of different types of cards you could take. And this is where it got fun. This restricted decks. This made decks leaner. This made decks faster. This also made the decks even more representative of their immortal. If you were playing a deck for an immortal that had a high evasion, for example, you probably have a lot more defense, more dodges, and guards, and non-basic defenses than a deck that had a low evasion. And so that would play out. It also sped the game up, because this forced you towards smaller decks. And by forcing you to smaller decks, it meant you went through to the decks faster, churning through that endurance faster. Somebody drawing their last card first, assuming that they didn't take damage over the course of it. And that was important because one of the flaws of the first edition was a game took a while to play. It was not a fast-playing game. And card games really need to be fast. So by leaning it towards smaller decks, quicker playing decks, that sped things up. They also split exertion into two types. Hard exertion, which was pretty much what you would use for power blows and a few things, was the old school exertion. You discard those 5 cards. And then they had the soft exertion. That's what you would make if you didn't have a card to play that turn. Or some cards would actually tell you to do something with a soft exertion. And what that would be is you would pull the top 5 cards off your deck and put them down onto the bottom. Now, the first edition had some things that had random chances. And so in those, it would be you would roll a die. 1, whatever happened. How they changed it in the later editions is you would make a soft exertion for the gem on the card that you were doing. If you pull the card with that, you showed it, and then you put those cards back on the bottom of your deck. And that is really how things worked out. Now, when I was doing the research for this video, I actually found out that the game is still being made. It's kind of in indie underground publishing style. It's like the person will release a couple sets and sell them on eBay. I'm not sure exactly how it's working. Also found out that there is still an active community playing this game. Strangely, they're mostly centered in the Midwest. I would totally not think of Kansas as a big place for a card game. But apparently, they do a lot still out there in Kansas. That was a surprise. I'm going to include a link to the publisher in the description below. So you can go ahead, check it out. Because, honestly, I would love to see this game getting popular again. Just because it was such an interesting game in how it played. Of course, I also love the franchise that it was based on, but that's beside the point. Anyway, that is all I have to say for this week. If you enjoyed this video, please click like and or subscribe down below. And I will see you next week. I have not decided my topic for next week, but I will have something to talk about, because there are many, many books in the archive. Have fun, and keep gaming.